Don's here tonight to give us more words of wisdom from his perspective on how Australia's facing a financial black hole. Now, it's interesting days when you have interest rates set such that, well, zero interest rates are becoming the norm, and the notion of negative real interest rates isn't just the preserve of economists anymore. You have mortgagees talking about it. When public expenditure is such that we get into a problem because governments spend too much money, and then we're told that we'll have a problem if we stop spending too much money. I was thinking this afternoon that one of Australia's greatest political embarrassments was Pauline Hanson. And back in the day, she was asked how she'd plug what she'd do to deal with a budget deficit. She said, oh, well, if we don't have enough money, we'll just print some more. And now both sides of politics at the time rightly denounced her as being a clown and an economic half-wit. Fast forward to today, her approach is now apparently the common wisdom, and to a greater extent than she could have ever imagined. We have continual money printing as of the last resort around the world. So the funny days that we live in, and I can't quite figure it all out myself, and that's why I'm glad to have Don here tonight to give us his perspective on things. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Don Turkington.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to give you all the answers at all, and I can... Is this a mic, is it? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you all the answers on modern economic policy, because it really is a very bizarre time that we operate in, and I never did see the rugby because we were up in the Kimberley, and the ship we were on didn't get any signal of anything, so we didn't see any of that sort of stuff, so never really followed it. But tonight, just by the by, this reminds me very much of the Centre for Independent Studies, because some of you might have been there in Sydney. I was a director of that for 7 years, and we had a lot of these library-type gatherings, slightly bigger library, but basically the same sort of thing. So it's good to see out west you're doing the same kind of work here as CIS does.
Culture comes to Perth.
Sorry?
Culture comes to Perth.
Yeah, so it's great, and thank you for having me, and good to be here. On the subject of Australia's fiscal black hole, I really want to put that in a much wider perspective than just Australia, because as Paul was alluding to, the whole of the Western world is in a fiscal black hole, and Australia is just part of a phenomenon that is very widespread and very new, and no one really knows where it's going to take us. And the fiscal black hole, of course, has arisen because in the West, almost uniformly now, governments spend more than they earn, and that's the underlying cause of rising public debt, of course, and unorthodox monetary policy that Paul was alluding to. It's the growth of deficits worldwide that underlies what we're seeing at the moment in terms of economic policy. Now, historically, of course, deficits were cyclical events. They weren't chronic. Countries went into deficit, especially during wars, and when you came out, like the Second World War, when you came out of the war, most of the debt was repaid as prosperity returned. And that's historically what happened, that governments didn't really develop very big public debt. And that all changed as we got into the modern era, into the 60s. Lots of things changed in the 60s, but government fiscal policy changed. And so you started to get chronic, long-term debt, but not really a lot of public debt. Even right up until the later century, the 21st century, public debt was not that high when you take into account that, public debt at any point in time is all the accumulated actions of fiscal policy forever. The net position is the public debt at a point in time. So in 2000, the US had quite high public debt, but only, quote marks, 56% roughly of GDP, about 5 to 6 trillion of US dollars in 2000. Now, ironically, it took a Republican administration, that is George W., to really get going. And his sidekick, Cheney, said that he made a famous statement that deficits don't matter. And it was Cheney that coined that expression, and his boss, George W., acted as if he believed in it. So that by the time he went in 2000, end of 2007, the public debt in America had reached 70% of GDP. And so that was a very quick accumulation of public debt by historic standards under George W. Bush. Then, of course, along came Obama, and public debt went on to steroids, and that's the current situation now. And we'll talk about where they're at in a moment. But so that things have changed now. Not just, of course, in the US. It's happened everywhere. That basic trajectory of rising public debt through the early 2000s, and then very steep rise with the GFC, is duplicated in most countries. Certainly in Britain, followed the same pattern. Europe had always been spending a lot. And so by 2011, American public debt had gone, over the space of about 3 years, had gone through 100% of GDP. And now, of course, it's above 100%. Now, you think, well, that sounds a lot, but the company they keep, that's roughly the same as Ireland, roughly the same as Portugal, and higher than Spain. Now, it's hard to sort of believe that. And Britain now is about 90%, and so is France, about 90% of GDP. And of course, Australia has a really interesting story, and so does New Zealand, that both of them were paying down public debt because they were running surpluses prior to the current administration. And for 13 years, Australia had successive surpluses, so that in terms of gross debt, I'll talk about gross and net debt in a minute, but gross debt at the low point was just 10% of GDP. Now, governments, of course, hate the use of gross debt, gross public debt. They always talk about net public debt. And net public debt is gross public debt minus the government's financial assets. But of course, the financial assets of the government can't be sold to service or pay back public debt. It's like saying that we'll sell the super fund of public servants if you've got one. It's a sort of nonsense. There is no such thing as net public debt. They're apples and oranges, and you can't net them off. Gross public debt is the only meaningful understanding of the burden of public debt. It's the gross figure. Now, Australia got down to 10% prior to Kevin 07, and you get so much noise here as to what the real public debt situation is. Australia, being a federal system, has to take into account not only federal debt but also state debt. It really should take into account local body debt as well. And so it's very comparable to America, so that if you added state debt in America, it's way over 100% of GDP. Australia, the figures are very hard to come by because they don't like publishing state debt. So you have to estimate what current state debt is, but it's probably close to 20% of GDP, state debt. That's way over 200 billion, probably way over 220 billion. And federal debt is over that. So Australian gross debt gross public debt is over 40% of GDP. And now, that's pretty good compared with most countries. The only country that's below that is New Zealand. And that's amazing, that, you know, because Australia's always thought New Zealand was an economic court case. But New Zealand's about 36% of GDP. And Australia's rising very fast, whereas New Zealand's slowing down. So, you know, it doesn't matter who wins in a week or so's time, nothing's really going to change in this for quite a while. Now, the tragic thing about American public debt is that all the official forecasts from the Congressional Budget Office or from the President Office, all the forecasts now never arrive at a surplus. So there are no official forecasts in America for a surplus forever. Because basically what they take you through to is they take you through to about 2022 when you start to get the effects, the real effects of the baby boom. So then you've got all the baby boomers are old. You know, some of us are old already, but you're real old then. And so all the, so you don't get to surplus by 2022 and then you take off again into big deficits, irrespective of changes in fiscal policy. That's just current fiscal, you know, paradigms. So the outlook in many countries, and of course in Europe, is even worse in most countries. And then you've got to say, well, why is it? Why is it that fiscal policy, and as a result monetary policy, because monetary policy tends to be a response to fiscal policy nowadays, why is it so different from what we've always had in economic history up until about 2000, but certainly prior to the 1960s? Why is it different? And it's not just the GFC. Basically, and this is the tragedy of modern economics, is that debt policy, fiscal policy, is really a function of the dynamics of modern democracy. That when you think about it, that when governments rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always rely, as they say, on the vote of Paul. And so there's been an inherent tendency within modern democracies for governments to pander to the Pauls. And they do this in a number of ways. One is that they create more and more Pauls. That is, you have more and more entitlement programs which redistribute income through transfer payments from the Peters to the Pauls. So you get more and more Pauls, and that's what I call the Paulinization of the population, where more and more people receive benefits. Now, historically, benefits were always related to need. Nowadays, they're not related to need, and there's many, many instances of modern benefits that have nothing to do with need. Now, New Zealand is a classic example of that. If you're 65 in New Zealand, irrespective of your financial situation, you must receive a pension. You can't give the pension back. You can't not receive it. You know, the richest person in New Zealand is going to get that pension. And the pension is amazingly generous. It's 2/3 of the average wage for a married couple, and an adjustment down for a single person. Everyone gets that at 65. Now, also, so that's one end of the spectrum. All of those people are becoming more and more Pauls, if you like. They're becoming more and more recipients of transfer payments. At the other end are the family benefits. And Australia has a very similar thing, but in New Zealand it's called working for families. It's got nothing to do with working. It basically provides payments, benefit payments to families up until $125,000 of income. Now, how bizarre is that in a country where the median family income is 68,000, or maybe 72 or something now, but something around 70,000. So up until 125,000, you get this family working for families. So 3/4 of dependent families in New Zealand now get the working for families benefit. Or everyone, 100% of the population over 65 get the national super. So when you think that 100% of people over 65 are Pauls, effectively, not necessarily net Pauls, but they've been brought into the benefit loop, and 3/4 of families with children are also receiving a benefit, you've got an enormous constituency for deficits. And so that, when you sort of understand just how widespread what I call the Paulinisation of the population is, you start to realise that it's just about irresistible. The result is that in America, you will have seen these figures, that now about 50% of Americans receive a benefit. Australia has somewhat lower because a lot of benefits here are means tested, but certainly in New Zealand would be 50%. So, and in Europe it's much higher. So you've got an inherent tendency for benefits to grow. And of course benefits, quite aside from all the redistributive things, when you think about it economically, they're incredibly wasteful, because what it involves is you take $1 from Peter and you give it to Paul, but you don't give $1 to Paul. So there's an economic loss in between, and that is the government's cost. And it's quite large. So, and you see it most vividly in modern transfer payments, which involve taking from Peter to give to Peter. What we at the CIS call tax and churn policies, right? Where it goes round in a loop, like paying wealthy families working for family benefits. So they pay $1 and they get back 65 cents economically, because some of it's gone to the government. So that's how kind of crazy the economics gets, especially when you take from rich people and give, wealthier people. You take from wealthier people and you give it to wealthier people. So that you've got this enormous tendency to push benefits higher and higher and higher. And you're getting it here. You've got amazing NDIS. That's going to be an amazing expansion of the welfare state. And the paid parental leave of Mr. Abbott is a very bizarre parental leave scheme. Even by New Zealand standards, that one's generous. So that, now, coupled with that, you've got another tendency underway in Western fiscal policy, and that is that fewer and fewer people now pay income tax. And more burden is being placed on Peters, but there are fewer and fewer Peters because fewer and fewer people pay income tax. And you see it here that we now have in Australia, as you know, you don't pay income tax on the first $18,200 of income, and effectively it's higher than that when you take into account other allowances. And so that in America, about 50% of people no longer pay federal income tax. Now that's an amazing change from 20 odd years ago, when it was about 20%. So the real poor didn't pay income tax because they had hardly any income. Now 50% of the population don't pay income tax. So you get 50% of the population in America don't pay federal income tax. They may pay some state tax, but not federal income tax. And nearly 50% receive benefits. Well, you've got a majority of the population in favour of ongoing deficits and ongoing public debt. It's really interesting to look at those figures, that the top 1% of income taxpayers, the ones that Occupy and all the rest of them hate, they're paying more and more and more and more of the tax burden. So the top 1% in, I better just get these figures right for you or I'll mislead you, but the top 1% in Britain, I think, pay 24% of income tax. And in America, I think they pay about 37%. That's the top 1%. Now that's way up on 20 years ago. But as a result of of the tax burden getting more and more narrow, the proportion of income tax to GDP is falling, almost right through the Western world. So smaller and smaller amounts of real income tax is being gathered by governments. Now, I think that's a great thing, but when it comes to a deficit, when they keep spending, it's not so good. So you've got a double whammy on deficits. You've got bigger and bigger welfare and more comprehensive welfare programs, benefit programs, transfer payments on the one hand, and lower and lower income tax in a real sense. So if you don't find somewhere else to tax, the deficit's going to get larger and larger, unless you cut expenditure. Now, those forces, however, are so powerful that irrespective of the political party, doesn't matter whether they're right or left, they basically in this century are acting the same. On the right, they talk about financial responsibility and that when they get in, they'll do something, but when they get in, they do exactly the opposite. They don't do anything, and they just, because they're pandering to these forces. The left, on the other hand, talk about social responsibility and how we've got to, you notice the use of the term investment? For everything now is an investment. That's what the left use to make wanton and ridiculous government spending appear responsible. But both parties, be they Libs or Labor or Republicans or Democrats, are subject to these same forces and are tending to not respond to the rising deficit. Now, Britain's a classic example. This is a so-called Conservative government. It's a coalition, but it's led by a Conservative party. Despite what they talk about austerity, British government spending is rising and British government public debt is rising. And that's despite everything that they say they're doing. It's not going down, it's just the rate of growth is slowing fractionally. So the public debt's getting bigger and bigger and bigger in Britain. And I don't think any of them really want to do anything because they'll go out. Because what they've created, the monster, see, there's an unholy alliance, what I call an unholy alliance between the elected and the electors. They're in it we're in it together. And of course, those forces were exacerbated by the GFC. They were there already. The spending was going up dramatically before the GFC, so it's wrong to say that all this is due to the GFC. The GFC actually gave these governments who wanted to spend an excuse to really hit the accelerator. And there's a wonderful quote, if I can get my glasses, getting old, I might get that benefit if I go back to New Zealand, that Obama put it this way. This is a great quote that I found somewhere, that this is how he thinks economics works, and how Rudd certainly thinks it works as well. When we've got new teachers doing great work with our kids, then you know what? They go to a restaurant and spend that money. And so suddenly businesses are doing well. The economy is doing well, and we get into a virtuous circle and we go up. Now that's really, really basic, ugly in Keynesian economics, right? But look at the way he's expressing it. He's expressing it in moral terms, that by government spending on teachers, which of course are great, you know, Gonski, that's a good thing. You give the money to the teachers, and the teachers go to the restaurants, and then it goes round in a circle, and and we get into this virtuous circle, and we go up, and that's what stimulus means. And stimulus, of course, is based on real crude Keynesian economics. And in Keynesian economics, as you all know, Keynes said that the markets really aren't self-equilibrating, that markets can lead to excess demand or excess supply, and that governments might have to come in, particularly in situations where demand is insufficient to meet supply of resources, particularly labour. So that's the essence of Keynesian economics, that governments, through deficits, make up that inadequate demand. And that's where this term stimulus. So Obama thought stimulus was great and went ballistic, and Rudd, of course, was one of the worst. Australian public spending went up faster than anywhere other than, I think, Slovenia or some other place. Not many went as fast. But you see, you're now expressing that rise in government expenditure in moral terms, a virtuous circle, that, you know, the markets let us down, we have to do something, the government will rescue you, you know, we'll stimulate the hell out of you, and we'll fix it. And of course, they fixed it to the extent that they couldn't fund it anymore. And so what did that lead to? That led to their central banks started buying the government's debt, print the money. So that's why we got unorthodox monetary policy that we've never had before. Anyway, that's a slightly different story. So the GFC gave a reason for governments to go back to Keynesian economics that had fallen out of favour because of stagflation, because Keynesian economics basically says that you can't have high inflation and high unemployment simultaneously. It's the old Phillips curve. Phillips was a New Zealand economist, and basically most of us think he got it wrong, that there's no inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So the Keynesian economics fell out of fashion and stagflation in the 1770s through to 2007. And then it took off again with guys like Paul Krugman from Princeton, and basically what they said is print money, stimulate, 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 it'll get us out of it. And so that's where we are at the moment. We're in the fiscal black hole, not just Australia, but the whole of the Western world. Unfortunately, the forces that I've described, I believe, are so powerful that it's pretty hard to see how it's going to stop. We were talking earlier this evening, some of us, about the Federal Reserve's tapering program, that is slowing down the buying of government debt. Did you know that in the last year, the government, that is the Fed, which is an arm of the government bought 70% of its own new issuance in America last year? So the Fed prints the money to buy this stuff, and then they say, well, we've got no real problems because there's no inflation. Well, of course, we all know that the inflation of that official inflation figures are very misleading. You know, you ask anyone about their energy bills and real living costs, and there's massive inflation, but not according to the official figures, partly because the Fed doesn't use a thing called core inflation, which takes headline inflation and takes away the only things that matter to us, housing and energy. And they say that's too cyclical to have in there, so we'll take it away. And all of a sudden we haven't got much inflation.
We just left it with onions and potatoes.
That's it.
You're lucky.
Yeah. So they say, well, we've got nothing to worry about because we haven't got any inflation, and this printing money doesn't really matter. But one of the real problems that we're now getting, that we talked about earlier, is that the biggest holder now of US bonds, government bonds of treasuries, is the Fed, the government itself, bought with printed money. And when you think about it, when you get a run on bonds that you had just a few months ago at the start of tapering, the bonds got sold massively. See, 10-year treasuries have been down to close to 1%. They're now nearly 3%. That's a massive loss. The bond yields, the lower bond yields, the higher the price. So when interest rates go up, like they are in America at the moment, bond prices are falling very, very sharply. And who's the biggest holder of US government bonds? The Fed. So there's a great worry in economic circles among conservative economists like me that the Fed could technically get bankrupt. Now, it's a technical bankruptcy. That means that it has no equity. They can always print more money to try and get them out of the problem that they got with printing money. But one day that's going to lead to massive inflation. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of why these things happen is an expression by James Buchanan. Some of you will know that name, and he invented the term fiscal illusion. That economics is a very difficult subject because it's not intuitive. You think it's intuitive, but it's not. And what he was alluding to this in fiscal illusion. See, a deficit, fiscal illusion says that people can't identify the true cost of government spending. It's just about impossible intuitively to figure out what the true cost of government spending, and that's one reason why people like it. And when you think about a budget deficit is fiscal illusion, because the government is giving back more than it takes. It's manna from heaven. It gives you something for nothing. Of course, we know that's not true. It can't work like that. So the deficit itself is fiscal illusion. Secondly, taxes are largely illusory now because a lot of people pay PAYG. They never see the tax. It's gone. It's not that they get the income and then you give it back to the government. You just never get it, right? So you don't really know that tax burden. Also, then when you pay indirect taxes, often you don't even know that this is largely tax, or the petrol you buy is largely tax, or smokes, of course, is many times largely tax, or GST. Most people don't even know that they're paying GST on. Which item do they pay GST? So indirect taxes are even more difficult to identify. So when you get something from the government, you think, shit, this is great. You know, I'm getting Medicare. They gave me $50 for going to the, whatever, $35 for going to the doctor. Or I didn't have to pay $35. So you think you're getting it for nothing. But even people on no income tax are actually paying all these other taxes through their spending. And the final source of fiscal illusion, I'll end on this note, is inflation. And that's what I believe governments are going to rely on. I think we will have a massive dose of inflation. Already in Britain you've got quite high inflation, 3 to 4%. So you're starting to get, you've had negative real interest rates for quite a while in a lot of countries now. And the ultimate form of fiscal illusion is inflation. And by the government effectively inflating, they lower the real burden of future public debt. So they lower the real burden of paying the debt back. And ultimately, if you inflate enough, you not only lower the public debt burden, but of course you lower the value of everything else. So they effectively lower all our wealth in doing so, but that's what they'll do. So on that note, positive note, I'll end. I've got a copy of this talk here, but those of you who see the IPA review, the latest IPA review has got a version of this talk, a smaller version called Addicted to Debt. So that's meant to be out, Ron, you say? Tomorrow. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but there you go. I've seen the transcript, which I hope is basically accurate.
We'll open up to a few questions now.
Don, I'm sorry.
Far away, yes.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, I asked the same question when Dan Grossman was here, that unfortunately I think the dynamics are such that the pools are always going to win this argument, you know, or the other way people put it is you can't stop the politicians from using the public purse to buy votes.
Yes.
It's all the same.
Yes.
And so I think you're right. I think that we used the phrase, or I used the phrase last time, it's all going to end in tears, whether it's tears through inflation, because mathematically, as you know, if you've got 100% of debt of GDP, even if you pay off at zero interest in 20 years, you need 5% of GDP per annum to pay off at zero interest. That's impossible, of course. So therefore, you're never going to pay the debt off. Never.
There's a very interesting way of looking at that, paying the debt off, and that is, it doesn't really make sense to talk about public debt as a percentage of GDP because the government can't get at GDP. All it can get at is its revenue. So if you take the better ratio is public debt to current revenue. And if you do that in America, it's basic, and then you assume that the government has no other expenditure than paying off the public debt. So all its revenue goes to paying off the public debt. That takes it now about 6.5 to 7 years. And of course we know that that's not counting the interest in the meantime. That's just paying off the debt at the start when you start paying it off. So it's never going to, as you say, never going to happen.
Can I just have one last comment, then I'll retire, is the Keynesian thing, I mean, it was also as simple as this virtuous circle. Why don't Bangladeshis just print money and pay school teachers to go to the restaurants?
Well, of course.
Why are the Bangladeshis driving Mercedes motor cars?
That's right. That's right. And why? Well, the classic example of that is Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe, you know, one of our friends from there, you might have met him, Ron, the senator, one of the few white senators there. I'm trying to remember his name. He gave me a sort of, I don't know what it was, $1,000 million note or something. And the only way they stopped it there was to ditch the currency and adopt the US dollar. So that's what they have.
I'm thinking of the very sophisticated professors of Princeton.
Yeah. But that
is Keynesian theory. Yet, if you put it this other way,
yeah. Well, Zimbabwe is a classic example. That Zimbabwe printed so much money that this room full of their notes couldn't buy anything, and so they were poverty-stricken through that, partly because of that policy. We all know it's nonsense. And Krugman's one of the worst, because what he says is that the only reason why basically America has had the slowest post-recovery growth in all business cycles, certainly much slower than the 80s when Ronnie Reagan came in. So there's a very, very slow recovery and very poor recovery in the Western world. And what Krugman and people like that say is, the only reason is you haven't done enough stimulating. And like the Japanese, Abe economics, see Japan's public debt is 250% of GDP. So far it's been largely funded by Japanese savings, private savings, because they're great savers and they buy this debt. But now they're off again. You know, they've been on this crazy style of economics from about 1995, and it's done nothing for Japan. The only thing that it does, I'll finish because I know it leads to, we've got massive inflation already, and it's asset inflation. It leads to, the first was evident in bonds, when US Treasuries went down on the yield. Now they're going up a bit, but they've basically been going down all the way through. So there was a inflation in bonds because the prices went up a lot. Then you got inflation in stocks. And basically what the zero interest rate policy is designed to do is to stop you saving. How crazy is that? I mean, we got the GFC because of excess debt and excess expenditure. Then you bring in a monetary policy to try and encourage people to spend even more and not save. So if you've got savings, you have a massive real decline in your savings. So you're forced initially into bonds through Allen and other good fund managers, whatever it is. And then when bonds have run their course, which they basically ran their course, you by default go into equities. The only reason why, if you looked at equities worldwide, most markets are almost at an all-time high. Yet most economies are tanked, including this one. And you think, why is that? Why? The only reason is excess liquidity. So the inflation that you're getting, and they want this to happen, the Fed, the inflation you're getting is in asset prices. You've got a reflation in house prices in America. It's a bit jittery, but it's basically going up. You've got massive house price inflation in New Zealand. You might have noticed that the Reserve Bank last week in New Zealand's introduced controls on LVRs, low deposit loans. And there was an article, I think, in the AFR about it today. And that's to try and put a brake on that. So that's how inflation shows itself for a while. so there's three big asset booms: bonds, equities, and houses. And that's common in a lot of places. Go to London, my goodness me. And then eventually it'll come out in consumer prices. It's coming out in certain consumer prices already, but it will. So it's not. But you see, the idea is